The English department at Paducah Community College and Cable 2 presents a series entitled Irvin S. Cobb, His Life and Literary Achievements. We have with us for this first and probably the most significant in the series an interview with Irvin S. Cobb's granddaughter, Buff Cobb, who is an actress, a producer, a writer in her own right from New York City. And in an informal setting, we want to talk with Buff about her relationship with her grandfather and something about his literary achievements in American literature. It's nice to have you in Paducah.
Well, it's marvelous to be here.
What special memories do you have of your grandfather?
Oh, they come crowding in. You know, I knew him very, very, very well. I called him Ivy, by the way. So when I refer to Ivy, don't think it's some vine that we're discussing. It is Irvin S. Cobb. But I lived with him from the time I was about 5 or 6 years old until he died when I was 16 or 17. So it was on a day-by-day, intimate situation. I always get a marvelous kind of mental picture of Ivy. And it's always in a great big chair. And he wore smocks, like artist smocks.
Yeah, okay.
And they were all handmade for him. Some of them were pale blue, some of them were cream, some of them were bright red. He loved reds, blues, yellows, very vibrant. He'd wear an Indian blanket if he could have gotten away with it. Those are the colors that he liked. With an enormous, great big belt. Some of them were 5 or 6 inches across with big buckles, and some of them were big concho belts. And very often, well, most often, he had a great big cigar, and very often, even in the house, he had his hat on, which was some kind of in between a cowboy hat and a thing. The big brimmed kind of hat. A big brim kind of hat.
And two of the trademarks, the cigar and the hat.
And very often he would be in some kind of a strange riding breeches arrangement and sort of laced up boots up to the knees. Most peculiar costuming.
This was his daily dress, or just his morning dress?
No, that was his daily dress. That's when he didn't have to go out and, you know, be all dressed up, gussied up.
What was a day like in the Cobb home?
Well, he used to rise very early. He was always up at 6 o'clock. He had breakfast by 6:30. He was at his desk by 7, and that was the sanctum sanctorum. Nobody went near Irvin between 7 and about 12:30. He wrote every single day of his life, including the day he died. And of course, I didn't pay any attention to that. I was in and out of that room all the time. I used to climb in and say, Ivy. He'd say, come on in, Rabbit Head.
Rabbit Head, your nickname, right?
Where that came from, I don't know. Sometimes he called me God's Rabbit, and sometimes it was Rabbit Head, and sometimes it was Little Buff. Where's Little Buff?
Your mother's nickname had been Buff, right?
Buff, yeah.
Right.
And I would go in, and I'd sit on his lap, and he taught me to draw. You know, he was a marvelous cartoonist. Absolutely wonderful.
Yes.
So I learned how to draw a house when I was a very little girl, and a tree, and he was also great for a touch, because my allowance was about 25 cents a week, and I always knew it was a buck in there, you know. But I used to go in and out of there all the time, and I was the only one ever allowed, because he'd just roar like a lion. He was high-spirited, as we say.
But he was very professional in his diligence and in his
totally.
Discipline, wasn't he?
I went in one time, and I said, Ivy, how do you get to be a writer? And he said, you apply the seat of the pants to the seat of the chair. And he said, darling, don't do it. He said, it's the loneliest profession in the world. But he was an absolute disciplinarian for himself. You know, that was it. Then in the afternoons, we'd break. And there was always a toddy before lunch, and then he would spend the afternoon working on his Indian collection.
And that, as I understand it, was his favorite hobby.
That
right?
was really his hobby. I mean, his inside-the-house hobby. He had the biggest private Indian collection, I guess, in the world.
Now, where is that now?
It's at the Huntington Museum in Pasadena. That's where most of it is. I have one piece of it.
Which is?
Which is a great, big, beautiful, it's about 5 inches long. It's Indian silver and has a turquoise turtle mounted in it.
Yes.
And it was an Indian Braves armband because the places for the thongs are still in it. It's a great big piece.
Right. And have you ever thought about doing anything with it?
Yeah, I wanted to make a belt out of it, but you can't really sit down with a piece of silver that big.
No, you wouldn't.
You have to stand bolt upright.
Right, all day long.
But he worked like that all the time, and then late in the afternoons, the house was always filled with people. The table was never set just for my mother and grandfather and grandmother and me and maybe my brother if he was on his good behavior. It was always set for 6, 7, 8 because people would drop in, and we always had people for dinner.
If your brother were on his good behavior,
well, he was the Hellion in the family. He's younger than I am, and he was boy, you know, all the way. I mean, he got hold of one of my grandfather's rifles once, and he managed to puncture quite a large hole in the plate glass window, which looked over the mountains and the canyon and the golf course down below. I think he was severely punished for that.
No, I can imagine. Now, this is in Santa Monica,
This is in Santa Monica I'm talking about.
And they had gone there for...
He had gone out to California originally to write for Hal Roach. He did a wonderful, wonderful picture that I happened to see on a late show about a year ago called the Call of Bugle Ann.
Huh. Okay.
It's a beautiful picture.
Okay.
And somehow, in writing some of these things, they said, Irvin, you're a personality, which he was. He was a ham, pure, simple, unadulterated, marvelous ham.
Naturally so. Right.
Naturally. He loved people. He was tremendously outgoing. He loved an audience. He loved to tell stories, so they put him in films. I don't think he was ever really as good in films, structured, as he was, you know, just sitting around the living room or on the lecturer's platform where he was superb.
Right. Yes, and very, very sought after.
Oh, yes.
As an after-dinner speaker and
terrifically
a
sought after.
Of course, people here in Paducah are familiar with his most famous movie with Will Rogers.
With Will Rogers. I gather
that
they drove, the two of them just absolutely drove the director crazy because they ad-libbed everything.
Can't you imagine? And he was in one other movie with Jane Withers,
well,
is that
he did another one with Jane Withers, and then he did another one after that. Oh, boy.
So at least 3.
At least 3.
Yeah.
At least 3.
An interesting story behind the house in Santa Monica.
When they went out there, my grandmother said, now come on, Irvin, do not run out and buy a house. You know, he liked to go out and buy houses. Said, I want to get my feet wet out here. I want to see what's going on, where it would be nice to live, and it's got to be a certain kind of house. And said, I don't want a great big place again. So he disappeared. He had to go to the studio or whatever. And he came back and he threw the keys on the bed and he said, here you are, Lal. Here's your new home. He said, Irvin, you just didn't. He said, yes, I did. And he bought the old Greta Garbo house, which is a wonderful house. And she went out to look at it and said, Irvin, this is enormous. I said, well, you know all those children are going to come out here sooner or later. Children meaning my mother and my brother, and me, and the dog, and the cat, and Nanny. And we all arrived on his doorstep one day, as predicted, and there was plenty of room for all of us. It was the biggest heart, you know.
Yeah, it seems.
He loved his family.
Oh, that's
I think
good.
we probably all drove him crazy one time or another, but he was very, very family-minded.
Your mother wrote that famous little piece, My Wayward Parent. What was her relationship with your grandfather like?
Very, very good. Very good. He was very tough on her professionally. Whenever you worked with Irvin, you were dealing with a perfectionist, and if you were dealing as a professional and as a writer, you were dealing with a professional. I mean, there was no father-daughter. I mean, when they criticized each other's works.
Your mother was a writer then, right?
Oh yes, good writer, very good writer. Her first book was published when she was 21 years old, and she did a number of them. And she did a number of screenplays.
Huh? I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
The Wayward Parent. When did she do that?
She did that just after Irvin died. You know,
and refresh our memory on what she does in that. I think most people would have read that or know something about it.
Well, she does a very good portrait of her father and of her mother and their relationship, which was interesting because two people couldn't have been more dissimilar. Irvin was a great big man. He was over 6 feet and started out his career being called Shrivelly.
Shrivelly?
Shrivelly, because he was tall and skinny.
Slender, okay.
And he managed to eat himself into a couple of 100 pounds worth of weight, enjoying every minute of it, I can tell you. And she did, I think, a wonderful portrait of the two of them, and of two very dissimilar people who managed to stay and have a very strong union and bond, being as dissimilar. My grandmother liked champagne, she liked Paris, France, she liked all the pretty clothes, she liked perfume, she liked to gamble.
Gamble?
She was a great gambler.
Ah,
She'd go any place to gamble, but she played bridge and she liked chemin de fer and she liked the south of France. My grandfather liked South America and Canada and his buddies, his cronies, and he liked to hunt and he liked to fish.
And play poker.
And play poker and sit around, you know, telling stories. They didn't, I don't think they knew what either one was talking about. I don't think my grandmother had any idea, as a matter of fact, I know she didn't, that when Irvin was sitting looking out into space, he was writing, he was creating. And she'd come in and say, oh, well, there's something and the children aren't doing this, or that. Never heard.
And he was sitting there looking out into space.
Working.
Working.
That's how writers work. You know, a lot of time they sit and look out into space. It means they're working.
And she made the comment once that I read that he had the habit of keeping a notebook.
Yeah.
And that he would write down just little bits of information, particularly things that he had observed.
Well, he was, well, first and foremost, he was a reporter.
Right.
And you know, like Quote says about himself, I'm the best damn reporter there was, and if you don't think so, well, I'm telling you, I am. I just am. And I think he always thought of himself as, first and foremost, a reporter. And he had a reporter's eye. And nothing went by those bright blue eyes. And he'd scribble. And the notations that he'd scribble, whether they'd be a personality comment or a bird or a tree or something, would give him the clues for writing.
For what he would do next,
For what he would do next.
He got started in journalism, of course, here in Paducah.
Here in Paducah, yeah.
And then went to Louisville and then on to New York. There's an interesting story about your great-grandfather's relationship there and then what happened to...
well, I guess my great-grandfather, Joshua Cobb, was not quite as dependable as his son, Irvin. I gather that one of the family failings was being highly interested in bourbon, rum, and good things like that. But he managed not to be a tremendous success. And I think my mother said something about the Joshua Cobb's fortunes were failing, and Irvin had to quit school because originally he was going to be sent to a military school and then on to college. And he went to work when he was 14 or 15 on the paper, and he was editor by the time he was 19.
And the youngest in the country at that time,
yeah,
too.
I don't think there's ever been another editor of a paper at 19.
I've never heard of one
No.
at that age. But when he got to New York City to break in, tell that story as to how he...
Well, my grandmother was a nudge. She was the little pinprick, I think, for Irvin. Also, she had such enormous faith in him. She thought he was the greatest writer that ever lived, the greatest man that ever lived, and he could do anything, and he could conquer all worlds. Nothing was too big for Irvin. Well, of course, Irvin had a good job, and he was a little nervous about it. So she said, listen, where's the biggest city in the world? It's New York City, and if you're going to move to a paper, it's going to be New York. So he said, well, how can I do it? You're just going to have a baby, and my mother, and my sister, my younger brother, you know, the whole family thing. She said, I'll write my father. And she wrote her father, and he subsidized Irvin, gave him $200 to go to New York and break in on the so-called big time. And she went home to Savannah with the baby, who was just a few months old.
Waiting for him to
get a job.
Right.
And he hit every newspaper office in New York And at that time, he hit it in August, which is a great time. That's the time that they used to lay off all reporters.
Oh, okay.
So,
sure.
Everybody,
his timing.
You know, his timing was just perfect. And he couldn't get anywhere. He never got, you know, beyond an office boy. And he was very discouraged. And it seems he went out to the park and he sat down being very discouraged about the whole thing. And he told me it was the only honest to God, real, true inspiration he ever had in his life. And it hit him and he bolted out and he bought very, very expensive paper from like Tiffany. And you know,
yes.
he didn't have any money, and heavy, very beautifully heavy cream vellum paper. And he went to a secretary and had each one of these done with the name to the editor. And he said there's no copy that exists, but as far as he could remember, he said, my own personal worth precludes my spending any more time. And he, you know, and I don't want to be trifled with office boys, and this is your last chance. And the line forms on the right, you will not be able to get my services after whatever it was. He sent off these 14 or 15, because there were a lot of papers in New York at that time, and he got a reply from every single one of them.
Offering him a job, right?
Yes.
And he took the job with
the Sun first.
Right, and then he was with the Evening World.
With the
wasn't he?
World.
With the World, right.
With McGill, who I guess was just the meanest man who ever lived, and just very, very tight ship, and was horrible to all of his reporters. And that was where the quote from Irvin, somebody said, oh, you know, McGill is sick. And Irvin said, I hope it's nothing trivial. It's been attributed to everybody, but it really was honest to God, pure Cobb.
And then later he worked as a staff writer for the Saturday Evening Post, didn't he? And,
well, he was offered a job. It meant that he was going to have to quit the paper. And at that time, he was the highest priced newspaper man in the world for that time, per word. He was being paid per word. And it was, again, a big decision. I mean, that's really jumping into the deep end of the pool when you have a very secure thing, and he was making a lot of money.
Right, yes.
To go off on a freelance basis and start writing short stories. The first of those was The Escape of Mr. Trim.
How did that come about?
Well, he went up, he agitated all summer long, and they were staying up at Lake George or someplace like that. And finally, who knows where inspiration comes from, but all this very, very acute eye and ear that he had collected it, and somehow out came The Escape of Mr. Trim, and it was an enormous success. And then someplace in there came the idea for the Judge Priest series, and as you know, that went on and on and on in the Saturday Evening Post forever.
Right, and Cobb was a very popular with the American reading public at that time, wasn't
enormously
he?
popular. He was one of the most popular writers, I guess, in the country.
And of course, no better medium than the Saturday Evening Post for...
Well, it sure was circulation, let's put it that way.
Right, and something that I dare say we don't recognize in the 1980s in terms of...
I always have felt, because of Irvin's wit and his tremendous capacity for people, that he would be, if he were alive today, he'd be Johnny Carson.
Probably so.
I think he would have that enormous, he had an enormous appeal to the American public. And he was tremendously successful on the lecture trail and with stories. And he was a good reporter, so he was a good interviewer.
Right, right.
And his medium, I think, would have been television. Right. I think he would have been wonderful on television.
Well, he had the radio show,
yes,
Paducah
he did.
Plantation,
but
didn't he?
Again, that was scripted. His medium would have been a talk show on television. He would have been sensational.
Okay. Where do you see your grandfather's place in American literature?
I would think, I don't know what's going to happen with time. I would hope with time he will become one of the most important American writers. His sense of color. He was a good writer. A lot of people, I think, feel that Irvin is old-fashioned and old hat. If you reread it now, I don't find it that way at all. I find a lot of it, period, but very strong writing. Very, very strong writing.
A very strong local colorist.
Oh, tremendously.
And this sense of Paducah was absolutely marvelous. To think that even something like The Escape of Mr. Trim, which had roots in an actual event.
In an actual event.
That he was able to recall the things of Paducah when he was growing up.
Total recall.
And form the basis for most of his short stories.
Well, when
and
he was
novels
first in
about
New
Paducah.
York, he roamed the streets of New York, and the things that he did on New York, like Occurrence up a Side Street.
Right.
I love all of his dark works. I think they're wonderful. The Two Murderers.
The detective stories, right.
I think they're terrific.
Yeah. What about his autobiography, Exit Laughing?
That's a marvelous book.
Yeah, and dedicated, I found out, to you, yes. Yeah. And to his Paducah cronies, too.
Well, he did a very cute thing in that, you know, he said to my early cronies and to my middle years and to my later years, I hope they will all forfeit their rights to my beloved granddaughter.
Yeah.
With my honest name, which is Patricia Cobb Chapman. No wonder people call me Buff, right? It's not hard to figure out.
His last will and testament.
Well, that's almost my favorite piece of writing. I love it. I read it, you know, if I get a captured audience at home, I'll get that out and read it to them. I think it's this wonderful piece of work.
It's so fresh. It's so open. Refresh our memory on some things that are there.
Well, you've got it there.
Ah, yes, I do. Here.
You've got it there. I love every bit of it, but it's irreverent. And
freshly so.
Totally freshly so.
That's what's so amazing to me.
Oh, incidentally, there's a thing here. He says, when convenient suits, that I ask that the plain canister, nothing fancy there, please, containing my ashes, shall be taken to Paducah, and that at the proper planting season a hole shall be dug in our family lot or elsewhere at Oak Grove, and a dogwood tree planted there, and the ashes strewn in the hole to fertilize the tree roots. Should the tree live, that will be monument enough for me. And I went out there yesterday.
Oh, yes.
And I planted that tree.
You did?
I planted it.
Ah, and it is still living, isn't it?
No.
Oh, it's not.
But
there is a dogwood tree there, though, isn't it?
Somebody, and nobody's been able to tell me who, has gone in and planted a new baby dogwood.
Ah, marvelous.
Which, so obviously his monument will be kept green and alive.
As long as his memory lives in Paducah. Your grandmother is buried there, and so is your mother,
and so is my mother, yeah.
Yes.
They're both buried there. And I had some bushes planted out there today, some azaleas.
Oh, beautiful. That will mark the spot very well. I like the arrangements here that had to do with the choir. For the wind-up, I'd be grateful if some of my colored friends sang first Swing Low, Sweet Chariot,
which
and then Deep River.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, I think I can count on Mattie Copeland of Jones Street, who for so many years was a loyal, loving servant of my family.
She was there.
To recruit the singers. And they actually did.
Oh, they did it.
Perform there.
Oh, yeah.
He had a marvelous relationship with the black community, don't you think?
Well, I think he had a tremendous relationship with them.
A sense of sympathy that might, in the 1980s, with the press of many things, be misunderstood.
Well, in my opinion, he was a very great liberal, particularly for his time. I think today, if he had lived, he would have understood the fight, would have sympathized with it, and been very much for it, because he believed very much in the dignity of man. And
someplace I read that the one thing he wanted to be remembered for was not as a humorist or a writer, but as a humanitarian.
Well, I think that's probably true. And when he got older and was perhaps a little more comfortable and more at ease, you know, he was a great joiner. He also believed very mightily in this country of ours, so he was very interested in politics. He switched his allegiance from the Democratic Party and went out and spoke for Wilkie, which must have been a wrench for his long Democratic soul.
Yes.
But he did. He did not approve of that third term.
Huh.
And he voted his conscience, and he spoke his conscience.
which he would have done, again, being a very open kind of person.
That was something he instilled in all of us. You do a certain amount of charity for your community, you're a good American, you vote, you don't disenfranchise yourself, whether you like the candidates or don't like your candidates, you vote, and you know your issues. We talk politics every night before dinner.
He was widely aware of what was going on around him,
tremendously aware.
Whether he was covering it or not, covering the
sure.
The
you know, he read
not.
everything in the world. So he always had a book in his hand.
An avid reader.
Oh, everything. He'd read the telephone book if there wasn't any. I've got a story to tell you about this book business. He always had his nose in the book. And one day he was sitting there, had the book, and he heard my mother come in. And he said, "Buff," not looking up. And she said, "Yes, Dad." Said, "Fix your old pa a drink." Well, his old pa, my dear, he was always waited on hand and foot by loving female relatives. Talk about chauvinist male. Okay, that's it. So he was sitting there reading, and my mother made the toddy, the bourbon and things, and went over there and was standing in front of him. Irvin's still like this. So she takes his hand and cups it around the glass, and he still doesn't look up, and said, "Irvin, I've made the drink. Now do you want me to drink it for you?"
And he said, he never looked up, never said a thing.
Never looked up. He was right in the middle of something that was fascinating.
That had captivated him. Just a minute left here, and we didn't touch on his parallel relationship with Mark Twain.
Well, I think Mark Twain at this point is better known than Irvin Cobb, and I have a feeling because they really are the same genre of writing.
Right.
One, Mark Twain wrote novels. Irvin basically was a short story writer. He really didn't do novels. And as I say, he was a reporter. And also he came right after Twain, and it's from the same part of the country. It's only, what, 30 miles?
Right, right up the river, sure.
So it's very much the same kind of thing. I think ultimately Irvin will emerge as his own man very strongly and not be identified with Twain. Being a little bit prejudiced, I think Irvin's as good or a lot better than Twain.
Oh, so do I. Particularly, oh yes, yes. You know, much more fascinating, much more detail. The local color is tremendous. You had told me that he admired Mark Twain.
Oh, very, very much. Well, Mark Twain was a big hero of his, and it was years later when he finally got a chance to interview him, and I guess the old man was it was a curmudgeon, and he was so mean to Irvin, and Irvin went away so deflated. You know, the whole balloon, his great hero, had been awful to him. He was awfully let down by that.
So unlike this marvelous ham of Irvin S. Cobb.
Well, Irvin was open, very, very open. And of course there was always a dark side in him. When you read his writings, you know there has to be a dark side. But like most funny men, they have a very dark core.
Ah, yes. It's been marvelous having you with us.
Well, it's my pleasure.
I hope you get to come back to Paducah again, and I hope that maybe Cable 2 can air this out of New York City and get us on a larger network.
Wouldn't
Thank you very
nice?
much.
Thank
yes,
you very much. It's really been a pleasure.